The morning sun barely touched the ancient stone walls of the palace when Charles heard those words that would change everything. He had been walking through the long corridor that connected the east wing to the main residence, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The portraits of his ancestors watched from their gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow his every move. He had always found comfort in these morning walks, a moment of peace before the day's responsibilities descended upon him like a heavy cloak. Camilla stood near the window in the blue drawing room, her silhouette outlined against the pale light. She had been waiting for him, he could tell. The way she held herself, the slight tension in her shoulders, the careful placement of her hands. Everything spoke of a conversation she had been rehearsing. Charles had seen this before, this careful choreography of difficult moments. But nothing could have prepared him for what came next. "It's too late now," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the palace coming to life. The words hung in the air between them like suspended crystals, each one sharp enough to cut. Charles felt his breath catch in his throat. He had expected many things, discussions about schedules, concerns about public appearances, even disagreements about family matters. But not this. Never this. The staff had noticed a change in atmosphere immediately. Margaret, who had been arranging flowers in the adjacent room, later recalled how the very air seemed to shift. She had been working in the palace for 30 years, had seen celebrations and crises, joy and sorrow. But the silence that followed Camilla's words was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if the entire building held its breath. Charles stood frozen, his morning routine shattered like delicate porcelain dropped on stone. The comfortable predictability of palace life, the careful schedules and protocols that had governed his existence for decades, suddenly seemed meaningless. He looked at Camilla, really looked at her, and saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, a finality that frightened him more than any argument ever could. The previous weeks had been difficult, certainly. There had been tensions, disagreements that seemed to multiply like shadows at dusk. The public engagements had become increasingly strained, their smiles for the cameras requiring more effort each time. The staff had whispered among themselves, noting how they arrived separately more often, how their conversations had become formal and brief. But everyone had assumed it was temporary, a phase that would pass like so many others before it. William, the head butler, had been the first to sense that something deeper was amiss. He had served the family for 4 decades, had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the subtle signs of palace life. The way doors closed a fraction harder than necessary, the slight delay in responses to simple questions, the careful avoidance of shared spaces, all of it painted a picture he didn't want to acknowledge. That morning, as news of the whispered words began to spread through the palace like wildfire, the entire ecosystem of royal life began to shift. Schedules were quietly adjusted, meetings postponed without explanation. The communication team huddled in urgent conferences, trying to prepare for possibilities they couldn't quite name. Everyone moved with the careful precision of people navigating around broken glass. Charles finally found his voice, though it came out hoarse and uncertain. "What do you mean?" he asked, though part of him already knew. The knowing was perhaps the worst part. The recognition that they had been moving toward this moment for months, maybe years, like planets slowly drifting out of orbit. All the small compromises, the accumulated silences, the things left unsaid had built up like sediment until they formed an insurmountable barrier. Camilla turned from the window, and, in the morning light, Charles could see the exhaustion written across her features. She had been carrying this weight, he realized, carrying it alone while he had busied himself with duties and obligations. The crown he was destined to wear had always cast a long shadow, but he had never truly understood how it had darkened their private moments until now. The palace had seen many dramas unfold within its walls. Kings and queens, princes and princesses had loved and lost, celebrated and mourned. The very stones seemed to absorb these human dramas, holding them like memories. But this moment felt different. It wasn't the dramatic confrontation of historical record, no thrown objects or raised voices. It was quiet, devastating in its simplicity. Sarah, Camilla's personal assistant, would later describe how she had found her employer that morning, already dressed and ready far earlier than usual. There had been a resolve in her movements, a determination that suggested a decision long contemplated and finally made. She had chosen her words carefully, Sarah realized, had perhaps practiced them in the mirror like lines from a play no one wanted to perform. The ripple effects began immediately. A scheduled appearance was canceled with minimal explanation, citing unforeseen circumstances. The press office fielded calls with practiced evasion, neither confirming nor denying the rumors that somehow always seemed to materialize from thin air. The palace machinery, so expert at managing crisis, swung into action even as those at its heart struggled to understand what was happening. Charles sank into a chair, the weight of tradition and expectations suddenly unbearable. He thought of his mother, how she had navigated her own trials with such apparent grace. But she had always had Philip beside her, a constant presence through decades of change. The thought of facing the future without Camilla, of ascending to the throne alone, was almost incomprehensible. The morning continued around them, indifferent to personal catastrophe. Breakfast was served on schedule, though neither touched it. The daily briefing papers arrived, their contents suddenly seeming absurdly trivial. How could he concentrate on matters of state when his personal world was crumbling? The divide between public duty and private pain had never seemed wider. Dr. Hamilton, the palace physician, was discreetly put on alert, not for any physical ailment, but because the staff had learned over the years that emotional upheaval could manifest in unexpected ways. The last thing anyone needed was a health crisis on top of whatever was unfolding in the blue drawing room. The doctor waited in his office, hoping his services wouldn't be needed while knowing they probably would be. As the hours passed, a strange choreography developed. Staff members found reasons to walk past the blue drawing room, not lingering but assessing. Trays of tea appeared and were removed untouched. The normal bustle of palace life continued, but with a muted quality, as if everyone was performing their roles at half volume. Charles tried to process what was happening, but his mind kept circling back to happier times. He remembered their early days, when everything had seemed possible despite the obstacles. The secret meetings, the coded messages, the joy of simply being together away from prying eyes. How had they traveled from that happiness to this moment? The journey seemed both endless and suddenly short. Camilla watched him struggle and felt her resolve waver. This was harder than she had imagined, and she had imagined it would be nearly impossible. But some truths demanded to be spoken. Some realities faced no matter the cost. The silence between them stretched, filled with years of unspoken words and missed opportunities. Outside, London continued its daily routine, unaware that behind palace walls, a personal drama was unfolding that would eventually touch them all. The tourists gathered at the gates, taking photos and hoping for a glimpse of royalty. They couldn't know that inside, the very foundation of what they had come to see was shifting. The irony wasn't lost on Charles. He had spent his entire life preparing for a role that now seemed hollow without the person he had assumed would be beside him. The ceremonies, the traditions, the weight of history, all of it paled in comparison to the simple human need for companionship and understanding. But perhaps that had always been the challenge, balancing the demands of an ancient institution with the needs of the heart. As morning gave way to afternoon, the palace held its collective breath. Meetings were conducted in whispers, plans made and unmade. Everyone waited for some signal, some indication of what would come next. But in the blue drawing room, time seemed suspended, two people caught between past and future, between duty and desire, between what was and what might have been. The words echoed in Charles's mind. It's too late now. For simple words that carried the weight of years, of choices made and unmade, of paths taken and abandoned. He wanted to argue, to fight against their finality, but something in Camilla's expression stopped him. This wasn't a moment of anger or impulse. This was something deeper, more considered, and therefore more final. The palace had weathered scandals and crises before. It had stood through wars and revolutions, adapted to changing times while maintaining its essential character. But this felt different. This was personal in a way that touched the very heart of what the monarchy represented. If the future king couldn't maintain his own household, what did that say about his ability to lead a nation? As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows through the tall windows, Charles and Camilla remained in their strange tableau. Two people who had loved each other through impossible circumstances, who had fought to be together against all odds, now faced perhaps their greatest challenge. Not external forces trying to keep them apart, but the internal recognition that sometimes love isn't enough. The staff continued their dance of discretion, managing the practical while avoiding the personal. Lunch was prepared but not served. Afternoon appointments were quietly rescheduled. The palace press office prepared multiple statements, not knowing which, if any, would be needed. Everyone waited, suspended in a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. In years to come, historians would analyze this day, trying to pinpoint exactly when things changed. But for those living through it, there was no single moment of transformation. It was a slow dissolution, like watching ice melt in the sun. The solid ground they had all taken for granted was revealing itself to be far more fragile than anyone had imagined. Charles finally rose from his chair, moving to stand beside Camilla at the window. Together they looked out at the city beyond the palace walls, at the life continuing unaware of their private crisis. He wanted to take her hand, to bridge the gap that had opened between them, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that some distances, once created, couldn't be crossed. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny planets in their own orbits. Charles watched them, finding in their random movements a metaphor for his own life. Despite all the planning, all the preparation, some things remained beyond control. The heart, it seemed, followed its own protocols. As the first part of this long day drew to a close, the palace remained in its state of suspended animation. The words had been spoken, their echo reverberating through corridors and consciousness alike. What would follow remained uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be quite the same again. The whispered words had shattered more than just the morning routine. They had cracked the very foundation upon which Charles had built his vision of the future. The days that followed Camilla's devastating declaration unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance and necessity. The palace, that great monument to continuity and tradition, found itself navigating uncharted waters. Charles moved through his obligations like a man walking through fog, present in body but absent in spirit. The crown he was destined to wear had never felt heavier, though it remained years away from touching his head. In the private apartments, a new geography emerged. Spaces that had once been shared became territories with invisible borders. The breakfast room where they had spent countless mornings discussing the day ahead now witnessed solitary meals. The empty chair across the table a constant reminder of what was lost. The staff adapted with the fluid grace of those long practiced in discretion, adjusting their routines without comment or judgment. Margaret, the head housekeeper, noticed how Charles had taken to spending long hours in his study, surrounded by books and papers that seemed to offer no comfort. She would find him there at odd hours, staring out the window at the gardens below, his tea growing cold on the desk beside him. The vigorous man who had always attacked each day with purpose had been replaced by someone she barely recognized. The public engagements continued, of course. The machinery of monarchy ground on, indifferent to personal pain. Charles attended ceremonies, made speeches, smiled for cameras. But those who knew him well could see the difference. The spontaneous moments of warmth that had characterized his public persona were replaced by a studied correctness. He performed his duties flawlessly, but the spark was gone. Camilla, for her part, maintained her own schedule with quiet determination. She had made her decision after months of agonizing deliberation, and While the pain was real, so was the relief. The constant pressure of living under scrutiny, of being measured against an impossible standard, of knowing that every gesture would be analyzed and criticized, it had worn away at her like water on stone. The press, sensing blood in the water, circled with increasing boldness. Photographers lingered outside the palace gates, hoping to capture some telling image. Columnists speculated with varying degrees of accuracy, their words adding to the pressure within the palace walls. The communications team worked overtime, crafting statements that said nothing while seeming to say everything. William, the head butler, found himself in the unusual position of managing two parallel households within one palace. Schedules had to be coordinated to avoid awkward encounters, meals planned separately, staff assigned with careful consideration. It was like conducting an orchestra where half the musicians were playing different pieces of music. One afternoon, Charles encountered Camilla unexpectedly in the rose garden. They had both sought solace in the same place, drawn by memories of happier times. The awkwardness was palpable. Two people who had once shared everything now struggling to find words for simple pleasantries. They spoke briefly about inconsequential matters, the weather, a mutual friend's health, while the weight of unspoken words hung between them. Dr. Hamilton, the palace physician, noted with concern the toll the situation was taking on both parties. Charles had lost weight, his face drawn and tired. Sleep, never easy for someone in his position, had become even more elusive. Camilla showed her own signs of stress, though she hid them better. The doctor prescribed mild sedatives, knowing they were treating symptoms rather than the cause. The children watched with their own mixture of concern and confusion. They had witnessed palace dramas before, had learned early the cost of life in the public eye. But this was different. This touched the very heart of their family structure. William, always protective of the monarchy's image, tried to maintain normalcy. Harry, more emotionally intuitive, reached out to both parties, trying to bridge a gap that seemed to widen daily. In the quiet hours of the night, Charles would walk the palace corridors, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The portraits of his ancestors seemed to judge him, their painted eyes following his progress. Had they faced similar moments? Had they too struggled to balance personal happiness with public duty? History offered examples, but no easy answers. The senior staff held discreet meetings, trying to plan for various contingencies. Protocol dictated certain responses, but this situation existed in a gray area not covered by any manual. They prepared for official separation, for reconciliation, for public statements, and private arrangements. The uncertainty was perhaps the hardest part, the not knowing which future they were planning for. Sarah, Camilla's assistant, watched her employer navigate this new reality with a mixture of admiration and concern. Camilla threw herself into charitable work with renewed vigor, as if helping others could somehow ease her own pain. She visited hospitals, attended fundraisers, championed causes with a dedication that bordered on desperation. Activity became her shield against the quiet moments when doubt crept in. The palace correspondence office noted a marked increase in public letters. Some offered support, others criticism, many simply expressed confusion. The British public, who had gradually come to accept Camilla, now found themselves unsure of where their loyalties should lie. The fairy tale they had been sold was revealing its human edges. Charles, meanwhile, found solace in unexpected places. His organic farming projects, once a subject of gentle mockery, became a refuge. He would spend hours in the gardens at Highgrove, his hands in the soil, finding in the simple act of cultivation a peace that eluded him elsewhere. The plants didn't judge, didn't whisper behind his back, didn't require him to be anything other than what he was. One evening, a state dinner required both Charles and Camilla's attendance. The palace protocol team worked overtime to manage the logistics, ensuring they were seated appropriately apart while maintaining the facade of normalcy. The foreign dignitaries, if they noticed anything amiss, were too diplomatic to comment. But the strain was evident to those who knew where to look. The Queen, watching from her own position of long experience, offered what comfort she could. She had weathered her own storms, had learned that the crown demanded sacrifices that few could understand. Her conversations with Charles were private, but staff members noted his demeanor after these meetings, sometimes comforted, sometimes more burdened than before. As autumn approached, the palace gardens began their annual transformation. Leaves turned gold and crimson, falling to carpet the carefully maintained paths. Charles watched this cycle of death and renewal with new eyes. There was a metaphor there, perhaps, though he wasn't sure he was ready to embrace it. Change was natural, necessary even, but that didn't make it less painful. The diplomatic challenges continued unabated. Foreign visits required careful choreography. State occasions demanded united fronts. Charles and Camilla had become expert at public performance, presenting a facade of unity even as the private reality grew more fractured. The smiles were practiced, the waves perfected, but the warmth that had once characterized their joint appearances was notably absent. Behind closed doors, lawyers began quiet consultations. Not for divorce, that specter was too frightening to name, but for formal arrangements that would allow both parties to maintain dignity while acknowledging reality. The negotiations were delicate, balancing personal needs with public responsibilities. Every decision had ramifications that rippled outward in ways impossible to fully predict. The younger palace staff, those who had joined during happier times, struggled to adjust to the new atmosphere. They had known only the Charles and Camilla who had fought to be together, who had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. To see that love story unraveling was to question their own beliefs about the power of persistence and dedication. One particularly difficult evening, Charles found himself in the music room, a space that held countless memories. He sat at the piano, his fingers finding chords from half-remembered pieces. The music echoed through the empty room, each note a reminder of evenings spent here with Camilla, of laughter and conversation that now seemed to belong to another lifetime. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on either party. They had endured years of separation, public censure, and personal sacrifice to be together. They had weathered storms that would have destroyed weaker relationships. But perhaps that was the problem. They had spent so much energy fighting external battles that they had failed to notice the internal erosion. As winter approached, the palace began preparations for the holiday season. Traditionally a time of family gatherings and public celebration, this year carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. Plans were made with multiple contingencies, guest lists carefully considered. The appearance of unity had to be maintained, even as the reality grew more complex. The press speculation reached fever pitch. Every public appearance was dissected, every gesture analyzed. Body language experts were consulted, unnamed sources quoted, theories advanced and discarded. The palace press office maintained its policy of dignified silence, neither confirming nor denying, but the pressure was building toward an inevitable breaking point. In quiet moments, both Charles and Camilla found themselves revisiting the journey that had brought them to this point. The early days of stolen happiness, the years of separation, the eventual acceptance and integration into royal life. Had they changed too much? Had the pressures of their position worn away the foundation of their connection? These questions haunted the long nights. The staff Christmas party, usually a highlight of the palace calendar, took on a subdued tone. The usual festivities felt forced, the traditional toasts awkward. Everyone was trying too hard to pretend everything was normal, which only highlighted how abnormal things had become. Even the Christmas decorations seemed to mock with their cheerful insistence on joy and unity. Charles threw himself into his work with renewed intensity. Climate change initiatives, architectural preservation, youth programs, all received his focused attention. If he couldn't solve his personal problems, perhaps he could at least make progress on larger issues. But even his most trusted advisors could see this was displacement activity, a way of avoiding the central crisis of his life. Camilla, too, sought refuge in purpose. Her literacy campaigns gained new momentum. Her work with domestic violence charities deepened. She found in the struggles of others a perspective on her own situation, though it didn't diminish the pain. If anything, seeing how others persevered through hardship made her own inability to continue feel like a personal failure. As the year drew to a close, a strange equilibrium emerged. Not peace exactly, but a kind of armed truce. Separate lives within the same institution, parallel paths that occasionally intersected for public purposes. The palace adapted, as it always had, absorbing this new reality into its ancient rhythms. The whispered words that had shattered the September morning continued to echo. It's too late now. For words that had rewritten the future, that had transformed certainty into question marks. What came next remained unclear, but one thing was certain. The palace would never be quite the same. The very walls seemed to have absorbed the sadness, adding another chapter to their long history of human drama. Looking back, the staff would remember this period as a time of profound change. Not the dramatic upheaval of scandal or crisis, but the slow, painful adjustment to a new normal. The palace had survived wars and revolutions, but this quiet revolution of the heart proved in its own way just as challenging. And through it all, the wheels of monarchy continued to turn, carrying everyone forward into an uncertain future. The new year arrived with a bitter wind that seemed to cut through the very stones of the palace. Charles stood at his window, watching the frost pattern the gardens below. The landscape looked alien under its white covering, familiar paths obscured, cherished views transformed. It seemed fitting somehow, this external reflection of his internal state. Everything he had thought permanent had proved mutable. Everything solid had revealed itself as fragile. The formal separation, when it finally came, was handled with all the discretion the palace machinery could muster. No dramatic announcements, no press conferences, just a carefully worded statement that managed to say everything and nothing simultaneously. Their Royal Highnesses have agreed to live separately while continuing their individual duties and charitable work. The language was bloodless, institutional, giving no hint of the human cost behind each carefully chosen word. The logistics proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. Two households had to be established where one had existed, complete sets of staff, separate schedules, divided loyalties. The East Wing became Camilla's domain, while Charles retained the main residence. Physical distance within the same building. It was a peculiarly royal solution to a universal human problem. Margaret found herself effectively managing two distinct operations, trying to maintain standards while navigating the emotional minefield. She noticed how certain rooms remained untouched by either party, spaces too loaded with memory to be comfortably occupied. The private dining room, where they had shared countless meals, became a storage area. The sitting room where they had spent quiet evenings was locked, its furniture covered in dust sheets like ghosts of happier times. The public reaction was mixed, as palace advisors had predicted. Some expressed sympathy for two people clearly struggling with an impossible situation. Others felt betrayed, having invested emotional energy in a love story that now seemed to be ending badly. The newspapers had a field day, recycling old photos with new, cruel captions. From fairy tale to nightmare, screamed one headline. The crown too heavy to share, declared another. Charles found the public scrutiny almost unbearable. He had grown up in the spotlight, had thought himself immune to its glare. But this was different. This wasn't about ribbon-cutting or speech-making. This was his heart laid bare for public consumption and judgment. He retreated further into himself, becoming even more formal in his public appearances, as if additional layers of protocol could protect him from the pain. William stepped up during this period, taking on more responsibilities, trying to shield his father from the worst of the pressure. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of duty and expectation. His own experiences had taught him the cost of living in the public eye, the way personal pain became public entertainment. He arranged his schedule to spend more time at the palace, offering silent support through presence, if nothing else. Harry took a different approach, reaching out to both parents with characteristic emotional directness. He refused to take sides, refused to allow the situation to divide the family further. His calls to Camilla continued. His visits to Charles increased. He became a bridge between two shores that seemed to drift further apart each day, though even he couldn't stop the tide. The staff noticed changes beyond the obvious logistical ones. Charles aged visibly, lines deepening around his eyes, his movements carrying a new weariness. He had always been particular about details, but now he became almost obsessive, as if controlling small things could compensate for the large things spinning beyond his grasp. Meal times had to be exact, routines followed to the letter. Any deviation met with disproportionate frustration. Camilla, for her part, seemed to find a new energy in independence. The constant pressure of being measured against an impossible standard had lifted, and, while the pain of separation was real, so was a certain lightness. She redecorated her quarters, choosing colors and furnishings that reflected her own taste rather than institutional expectations. She scheduled her own engagements, chose her own causes, spoke with her own voice. The irony wasn't lost on those who observed closely. In some ways, the separation had freed both parties to be more themselves. Charles could indulge his philosophical bent without worrying about boring Camilla. Camilla could embrace her more social nature without feeling she was betraying Charles's need for solitude. But this freedom came at such a cost that it hardly seemed worth celebrating. Spring arrived reluctantly that year, or perhaps it only seemed so to those within the palace walls. The gardens bloomed on schedule, but their beauty seemed muted, as if even nature was participating in the general mood of subdued mourning. The annual garden parties proceeded as planned, but attentive guests noticed the careful choreography that kept the separated couple from awkward encounters. Dr. Hamilton continued to monitor both parties with professional concern. The physical symptoms of stress were manifesting in various ways: disrupted sleep, loss of appetite, a general malaise that no medicine could cure. He prescribed what he could, but knew the real remedy lay beyond his medical training. Hearts, unlike bodies, didn't always heal according to predictable timelines. The foreign tours proved particularly challenging. Protocol demanded certain appearances together, state occasions that couldn't be avoided without causing diplomatic incidents. Charles and Camilla had become expert at performing unity for the cameras, standing the precisely calculated distance apart that suggested togetherness without requiring actual contact. They spoke when necessary, smiled when appropriate, and counted the minutes until they could retreat to separate quarters. One particularly difficult evening in Paris, they were required to attend a gala at the Palace of Versailles. The irony of the location wasn't lost on either of them. Another palace that had seen its share of marital discord and royal drama. As they moved through the glittering rooms, maintaining appropriate distance while appearing united, Charles caught Camilla's reflection in one of the massive mirrors. For just a moment, their eyes met in the glass, and the weight of shared history nearly overwhelmed him. Back in London, the palace settled into its new rhythm. Two courts operating within one institution. Careful scheduling preventing overlap, staff becoming expert at managing the delicate balance. The younger employees found it hardest, lacking the years of experience that helped their senior colleagues navigate such situations. They whispered among themselves, sharing observations and concerns, trying to make sense of how love could transform so completely into polite distance. The correspondence office noted a shift in public letters. Where once they had received criticism of Camilla, now they received letters of support. The British public, ever sympathetic to perceived underdogs, began to rally around both parties as individuals rather than as a couple. It was cold comfort, this public approval coming at the cost of private happiness, but it was something. Charles found unexpected solace in his faith. His exploration of different religious traditions, once seen as eccentric, now provided a framework for understanding suffering and transformation. He spent long hours in conversation with various spiritual advisors, seeking meaning in his pain, purpose in his loss. The answers, when they came, were never simple, but the searching itself provided a kind of peace. The approach of his mother's birthday brought new challenges. Family gatherings had to be managed with diplomatic precision. The Queen, ever the professional, maintained strict neutrality, but those who knew her well could see the sadness in her eyes. She had hoped for a different outcome, had believed that love conquered all. To see it conquered instead by the very institution she embodied was a particular kind of grief. Summer brought with it the traditional move to Balmoral, but even this beloved retreat couldn't escape the new reality. Separate accommodations had to be arranged, schedules coordinated to avoid overlap. The Highland air, usually so restorative, seemed thin and insufficient. Charles took to spending long hours walking the moors alone, finding in the harsh landscape a reflection of his inner terrain. One afternoon, he encountered Camilla on a remote path. Neither had expected the meeting, and for a moment they stood frozen, two people who had once shared everything now unsure how to share, even a simple greeting. They spoke briefly about the weather, the estate, anything but what really mattered. As they parted, Charles felt the weight of all the unspoken words, all the missed opportunities for reconciliation. The staff at Balmoral, many of whom had served the family for generations, watched with quiet sadness. They had seen royal marriages survive crisis before, had believed this one would prove equally resilient. But some breaks they were learning couldn't be mended by tradition or duty or even love. Some endings came not with drama, but with quiet exhaustion, the slow realization that holding on caused more damage than letting go. As autumn approached, bringing with it another round of state occasions and public duties, a new crisis emerged. The press had obtained photographs, innocent in themselves, but capable of misinterpretation. The palace communications team swung into action, but Charles felt something break inside him. He was tired of managing perception, tired of performing happiness, tired of pretending that duty could fill the void left by love. In a rare moment of vulnerability, he confided in his private secretary. The words poured out, the frustration, the loneliness, the sense of failure that haunted his nights. How had he, who had waited so long for love, managed to lose it? How had they, who had overcome so much, failed to overcome this? The secretary listened without judgment, offering presence rather than platitudes. Camilla, in her own quarters, was fighting similar battles. The freedom she had thought she wanted felt hollow without someone to share it with. She filled her days with meaningful work, surrounded herself with supportive friends, but the nights remained long and lonely. She had made her choice with full awareness of the cost, but knowing and feeling were very different things. The approach of the holidays brought fresh challenges. The public expected certain appearances, certain displays of family unity. The palace machinery cranked into gear, producing schedules and arrangements that satisfied protocol while acknowledging reality. But no amount of planning could ease the fundamental sadness of a family divided, of love transformed into polite distance. As the year drew to a close, both Charles and Camilla found themselves reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The whispered words that had shattered that September morning continued to echo, but now they carried different meanings. "It's too late now" had become not just an ending, but a beginning, not just a closing, but an opening to whatever came next. The palace, that great survivor of centuries, absorbed this latest chapter into its long history. The walls that had witnessed so much human drama added another story to their collection. And life continued, as it always did, carrying everyone forward whether they were ready or not. The future remained unwritten, but one thing was clear: the fairy tale had ended, and something more complex and human had taken its place. The years that followed the separation settled into a rhythm that no one had anticipated. The palace, that great stone witness to centuries of human drama, adapted to its divided household with the fluid grace of an institution built on adaptation. But beneath the smooth surface of protocol and procedure, the human cost continued to accumulate like interest on an unpaid debt. Charles had developed a routine that his staff recognized as armor against pain. He rose early, earlier than ever before, often greeting the dawn from his study window. The correspondence that arrived daily was sorted into careful piles, each demanding attention, each offering escape from personal reflection. He had become, his private secretary noted with concern, almost mechanical in his efficiency, as if constant motion could outrun memory. The transformation in his public persona was subtle, but significant. Where once there had been spontaneous warmth, now there was studied kindness. The man who had been mocked for talking to plants and expressing unconventional views had retreated behind a wall of conventional correctness. He performed his duties flawlessly, but those who had known him in happier times mourned the loss of his essential spark. Camilla had chosen a different path through pain. She had moved to Ray Mill House, her private residence, visiting the palace only when duty demanded. The distance seemed to help, allowing her to create a life that was hers alone. She surrounded herself with friends who knew her as herself, not as an appendage to royalty. Her charity work flourished, perhaps because she now understood personally the pain of dreams deferred and love lost. The children watched their parents' parallel lives with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. William, ever the dutiful son, divided his time carefully, ensuring neither parent felt abandoned. His own young family became a bridge, grandchildren offering moments of shared joy that temporarily eased the strange formality that had replaced intimacy. Harry, living abroad now, made regular calls, his distance perhaps making it easier to maintain relationships with both parents without feeling torn. The palace staff had developed their own strategies for managing the new reality. Schedules were coordinated with military precision, ensuring paths never crossed accidentally. When joint appearances were unavoidable, every detail was planned in advance. Entry and exit times calculated, seating arrangements mapped, conversation topics prepared. It was exhausting maintaining the illusion of unity, but the alternative, public acknowledgement of private failure, seemed worse. Margaret, the head housekeeper, noticed how certain objects had become almost talismanic. Charles kept a photograph in his study, turned face down but never removed. Camilla had left behind a scarf, forgotten in the move, that hung in a wardrobe no one dared clean. These small remnants of shared life became shrines to what was lost, too painful to keep visible but impossible to discard. The seasons turned, each bringing its own challenges. Spring meant the opening of palace gardens to the public, requiring careful coordination to ensure no awkward encounters. Summer brought Balmoral, with its memories lurking in every Highland view. Autumn meant state occasions, performances of unity for visiting dignitaries. Winter brought the holidays, with their forced cheer and family gatherings that felt incomplete. One particularly difficult Christmas, Charles found himself alone in the chapel at Sandringham. The familiar prayers offered no comfort, the ancient words feeling hollow in his mouth. He thought of all the compromises made, all the chances missed, all the words unspoken. The weight of regret was almost physical, pressing down on shoulders already bowed by duty and disappointment. The public had largely moved on, as publics do, to newer scandals and fresher dramas. The separation of Charles and Camilla had become simply another fact of royal life, like the changing of the guard or the state opening of Parliament. But for those living it, the pain remained fresh, renewed daily by 1,000 small reminders of what had been lost. Dr. Hamilton watched his royal patients with growing concern. The physical manifestations of emotional pain were becoming harder to ignore. Charles had developed a persistent cough that no medication seemed to touch. Camilla suffered from headaches that came with increasing frequency. The doctor prescribed what he could, but knew that some ailments lay beyond the reach of medicine. The irony of their situation became more pronounced with time. They had fought so hard to be together, had endured years of separation and public censure. Now, having won the right to their relationship, they had lost the relationship itself. It was like climbing a mountain only to find the summit crumbling beneath your feet. State papers continued to flow across Charles's desk, each requiring attention, decision, action. He threw himself into the work with desperate intensity, as if solving the nation's problems could somehow compensate for his inability to solve his own. Climate change, architectural preservation, interfaith dialogue, all received his focused attention. But his advisors noticed a new edge to his advocacy, an urgency that spoke of personal as well as global crisis. The formal divorce proceedings, when they finally began, were handled with such discretion that even senior staff were barely aware of them. Lawyers met in anonymous offices, documents were couriered under seal, agreements were reached in language that revealed nothing of the human cost. The institution would survive, as it always had, but at what price? Camilla faced the proceedings with a mixture of sadness and relief. The limbo of separation had become its own burden, the neither married nor divorced status creating complications at every turn. At least divorce offered clarity, a clean line between past and future. But signing the papers felt like signing away a part of herself, acknowledging finally and formally that the fairy tale had failed. The younger generation of royals watched and learned. They saw the cost of living in the public eye, the way personal happiness could be sacrificed on the altar of duty. Some drew the lesson that love must be protected at all costs. Others concluded that duty must come first, always and forever. All understood that the crown carried weight beyond its physical presence. As the divorce was finalized, the palace issued another of its masterfully bland statements. The language was carefully crafted to convey finality without drama, ending without blame. But those who read between the lines could sense the exhaustion, the simple human desire to stop pretending that everything was fine when everything was decidedly not fine. The division of possessions proved surprisingly simple. After all the complexity of shared life, the physical objects seemed almost irrelevant. Camilla took her personal items, her books, and photographs, leaving behind the jewelry and formal pieces that had never really felt like hers. Charles kept the gifts he had given her, unable to bear seeing them go, equally unable to bear seeing them stay. The first public appearance after the divorce was excruciating for all involved. A charity gala that neither could avoid without causing speculation. They arrived separately, spoke to different groups, maintained careful distance. But photographers caught a moment, a glance across a crowded room, a split second of unguarded emotion. The image made front pages globally, saying more than any official statement ever could. In the months that followed, a new normal emerged. Charles grew into his solitude, finding in it a kind of peace he hadn't expected. The constant negotiation of shared space was gone, replaced by the simpler challenge of filling empty space. He could indulge his eccentricities without apology, pursue his interests without compromise. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was something. Camilla discovered that freedom had its own texture. She traveled more, spent time with grandchildren, rediscovered friendships that had been neglected during the royal years. She learned to be alone without being lonely, to find completeness in incompleteness. The woman who had once been defined by her relationships was learning to define herself. The palace adapted, as it always did. New routines replaced old ones. New traditions emerged from the ashes of abandoned ones. The staff, loyal to the end, maintained their discretion even as they mourned privately for what had been lost. They had witnessed a love story that conquered impossible odds only to be conquered itself by the daily erosion of joy. As time passed, the acute pain dulled to a chronic ache. Charles and Camilla developed a cordial distance, the politeness of former intimates who knew too much about each other for true formality, but too little current connection for real warmth. They could speak at family gatherings without strain, share grandparent duties without conflict. It wasn't what anyone had hoped for, but it was what they had. The Queen, watching her son navigate this new reality, offered what wisdom she could. She had seen marriages survive crisis and marriages destroyed by smaller challenges. She understood that sometimes love wasn't enough, that sometimes the very intensity of feeling that brought people together could tear them apart. Her own long marriage had taught her that survival required more than love. It required compatible visions of what life should be. On quiet evenings, Charles would sometimes walk past the blue drawing room where those fateful words had been spoken. It's too late now. He understood them better now. Understood that Camilla had seen what he couldn't, that they had already lost each other long before that morning, that the words were recognition rather than decision. The palace had witnessed the end of their story, but the ending had been written in 1,000 small moments of growing apart. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but no longer impossible. Charles would be king, would wear the crown his entire life had prepared him for. But he would wear it alone, supported by duty rather than love, sustained by purpose rather than partnership. It wasn't the future he had imagined, but it was the future he had. Camilla would continue her work, her advocacy, her quiet life away from the spotlight she had never truly enjoyed. She would be remembered not as queen, but as the woman who had loved a future king, who had won him and lost him, who had chosen freedom over a crown that had never really been offered. It wasn't the ending anyone had written for her, but it was the ending she had written for herself. The palace stood as it always had, weathering another storm in its long history. Its walls had absorbed another story of love and loss, of duty and desire, of the endless human struggle between what we want and what we must accept. The whispered words that had shattered a September morning had become part of its memory, another echo in corridors that had heard so many. And life, indifferent to personal tragedy, continued its relentless forward motion. New challenges arose, new crises demanded attention, new stories began even as old ones ended. The monarchy endured, adapted, survived. But for those who had lived through this particular chapter, who had witnessed love transform into polite distance, something fundamental had changed. They had learned that even fairy tales could have endings that satisfied no one, that even the greatest love stories could conclude not with dramatic finality, but with quiet exhaustion. The palace waited, patient as stone, for the next chapter to begin. It had witnessed too much history to be surprised by human frailty, too much drama to be shocked by another act of the eternal play. Charles and Camilla had written their names in its annals, had added their story to its collection. Now others would come, would love and lose, would hope and despair, would whisper their own words in rooms heavy with history. But those September words, "It's too late now," would echo longest for those who had heard them, who had watched love crumble like ancient stone, who had learned that sometimes the most devastating endings come not with shouts, but with whispers, not with drama, but with the quiet recognition that what once was could never be again.